Okay, we've done a static table view demo. Let's now look at a dynamic table view. Now, the first problem we have here is what data source are we going to use? And often our applications are getting data from some type of network service. In order to do that in iOS, we need to understand the threading model and we need to understand how to do network type fetches, and we will do that, but we're going to defer that for now, and that's a future topic. And so I'm going to use some dynamic data sources that's already on the device, and one of those sources is the actual photo roll on my device, and even on the emulator device I have that. So if I go to my emulator here and you look, I do have my Photos app here, and you'll see that there's photos on it. I've got some nice scenery out there, and I've got a couple of albums. And so this is a dynamic data source. Every device has its own unique set of photo albums on it. So what I want to do is create a dynamic table view where I'm going to go off and use some libraries that iOS provides us to read my photo roll and just put up a table that looks kind of like the one you got right here. Okay, so I'm going to display the albums along with the default thumbnail set for that album. So that's what I want to do. So I'm going to create myself a new application in Xcode. And it'll be a single view application, and I'll call it my dynamic table view demo. And once again, I don't need this controller that's created here, so I'm just going to delete this thing, and I'll go to the storyboard. I do want a table view, so before I lose that thing there, I'm going to drag out a table view. I'll drag this down there, and then I'll delete the original. And let me make this a little bigger so we can see. Okay. And last time I showed you how to put this thing under nav controller by dragging a nav controller out here and then control clicking it and pointing it over. Another quick and easy way, so this is the shortcut I mentioned. So I'm going to select the controller, and if you go to the editor and you pick embed in, you'll see right on the menu I got nav controller, and if I pick that, bingo, it automatically puts it in a nav controller and it just slides it right over, so I'm done. Okay, single menu option, put that thing in a nav controller for me. Okay, so now I need to create a custom class that's going to manage this guy. So we're going to go in here, create a custom class. So under iOS, I'm going to pick Cocoa Touch class, and I'm going to give this thing the name album table view controller, and this is going to be a UI table view controller base class. And we'll click next, add that to the project, and then remember when you do this you always got to go back here, select this, and then tell it what the custom class is, right? So I need to make that association between my interface builder and the code. And now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a framework that iOS provides us to access the media on my device. So I can get photos, I can get videos, whatever. And it turns out that that's a framework that isn't automatically added to my project. Okay, so it's not automatically added like the basic UI kit and all that for doing user interfaces there, but the asset framework is not used in every application, so they don't put it in their default. So to add one of these frameworks, and there's other types of frameworks that you're going to deal with, like core location and things that don't get used in every application, so then you got to manually add those frameworks to your build. So to do this, I'm going to select the top level in my Project Explorer here, and when I select this view over here, I can add frameworks and libraries here. So you'll see down in the bottom of the screen here a little plus sign, and I just clicked that plus sign and it pops up this dialog here, and I can start typing in assets, and it's the assets library framework that I want to add to my project here. So I'll select it, click add, and now it's added. And so that's a necessary step. It won't work if you don't do this. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a little Singleton helper class that will allow me to get at this assets album. So I'm just going to create myself a little class here. And I'll call this guy my assets library. Wait, I think I want to do that by... One second. I'm going to select this and then do the add. And we'll call it my assets library. And this class is going to be called my assets library, and it's going to extend a class called AL assets library. But in order to do that, I also need to explicitly import that framework because it's not going to happen by default. So I need to come in here and say assets library gets imported, and my extension here is from AL asset library. And I'm going to have a class member, so we need to use the static. So I'm going to say static var. That means this instance variable, or this variable, is associated with the class, not with the instance. And I want a singleton pattern here. I only want one of these per application. So I can say, actually it's going to be a constant, let singleton equals, and then I'll call the initializer for this guy. And then I'm going to write a class level method, so a method that operates on the class, not the instance. So I use the keyword class func, and it's going to be a default instance is the name. It takes no parameters and returns the same type here. The body of this is simply going to return singleton. So that's just a really simple little helper that I'll be using. And let's now add a method to our table view controller class that loads up the set of albums that I have on my disk. So the first thing I want to do is add a property to this controller. So this is kind of the model. Okay, and it's going to be an array of albums, and the type here is going to be AL asset group. Okay, so that's the type of data that I'm going to get back. I'll initialize it to empty. And once again, I've got to import on the top here in order for that type to be visible. And I'm going to write myself a function that will load up the library. So I'm going to call this thing load albums. And I'll get my singleton reference here by calling my method. And now I can call this enumerate. So there's a method that takes a closure that will walk through all the albums in this particular device. And what I'm going to do is in the closure, I'm going to simply take each album in turn and stick it into that model array. So that looks like this. I can say lib.enumerate, and the one I'm going to use here is the one using block, and I think there's a failure block. Alright, so the first thing here is the types, and I want to use all types of albums here, so I can say that as follows. I can say assets group type, which is an AL assets group all. So that basically says I want everything. And then for using block, this here is going to be a closure. Okay, so we'll use a closure expression. So those start out with a curly, right? A left curly. And then we put in parentheses the arguments that are coming in. And if you read the documentation, you'll see that it takes a optional wrapping an asset group. And there's a stop condition, and you'll just have to take this on faith. It turned out to be quite a bit different than what I was used to in Objective-C, but this is what the documentation tells me to do. So there's my parameter list, and then the syntax says you say in, and then we put the code. Okay, so right after this in, we're going to put some code. And my code is going to do as follows. I'm going to say if the group, so that's what I'm getting in, is not equal to nil. So if that optional actually has something wrapped, then I'm going to do my append. I'm going to say self.albums.append group, and I'm going to unwrap it explicitly. Else, okay, if this didn't happen, what I'm going to do is just tell this thing to refresh the view, because the view is going to be drawn basically upon what I'm loading here. And so in order, when I get done, I'm going to get a nil, so I can do that. But the interesting thing, we haven't talked about threading model here, but this is a closure. Okay, this is a piece of code that's going to be executed later by this function. As it enumerates through the group, it's going to call. I have no guarantee. I'm passing this closure to a framework. I have no guarantee that when it gets called, it's going to be called on the main thread. Right? It's not going to be, because it's actually reading from flash memory. That's I/O. It takes time. And so it's going to call back on some kind of worker thread. So I need to kind of get this code. So I want to reload the view, but that's UI code. I can only deal with UI code on what's called the main thread. And we're going to talk about this more in detail. So if this is kind of woozy right now, it shouldn't be. If you've done any kind of work on any modern GUI, you kind of have this concept where one thread does all the UI updates. Okay, but we'll talk about it more. So if that is kind of making your head spin, don't worry about it. Just take it on faith, and this is the way we're going to do it, and later it'll start to make sense to you, so that we can synchronize, or we can get this logic to be called on the main thread by using this dispatch async, and then we need to send it a queue, and the queue is the main queue. And then we can put a block of code, and this is the code that will get executed on that main queue. And it's actually a closure, another closure. And we want to get this thing table view to reload its data. Alright. Now, the only thing left is our failure block, and this one's going to be pretty simple. My failure block is simply going to take an error of type NSErr wrapped as an optional, and we're just going to print out, oops, an error occurred. Alright, so then I need to get rid of this. And between these, we got to close the block. And that should do it. And it looks like I'm missing something here. This should be indented actually. This one here goes with that one. This is the next parameter to my enumerate types. Yeah, I think you're right. Right there. I need one, right? And this one's got a problem. Dispatch. That shouldn't be display. That's dispatch. What am I doing? Bingo. Alright. So we got our albums loaded now. So when we're done with this, it's going to not only populate this array, but it's actually going to force that table to re-render. So now we need to call this guy. So once we've loaded here, we'll say self.loadAlbums. So that loads the data, but we're not done yet because now we need to go and implement that data source delegate to get this data to display. So there's three methods, you'll remember. There's the first method that returns the number of sections. We're going to just go with a single section. Okay? But the second one here is how many rows are in each section. Well, how many rows are there going to be? It depends on how many entries we have in this array, right? So we can get that value by just returning self.albums.count. And that will tell it how many albums we actually discovered on the disk. And then there's one other function we need to implement for this data source. That's the one that says it's going to give us a section, row, pair, and it's going to say, hey, give me a cell for that. And so by default, if we go back to our storyboard, you'll notice that there is a prototype cell here already. Okay, and this thing has some default properties. It is pre-configured. You don't see anything because those properties are all set to 0. So we could just use this guy, and if we select this cell, we need to give it a identifier. So we'll call this cell ID. So I just gave it the name cell ID. And in our code, we need to uncomment this method right here. And you'll see that it's stubbed out some code here. This is going to be cell ID. So we're going to ask it for a cell of type, our prototype, which we just tagged as cell ID. And now we need to configure this thing. And that's fairly straightforward. All we really need to do here is, first of all, figure out what group are we dealing with. So we'll set up a group variable. And these are of type ALAssets group. So our group is of type ALAssets group, and it's simply going to be self.albums. And remember, that's an array. And we know it's the ith one, so it's index path. That's the input parameter here. And it's got an attribute row. So that's the data that we want to display. And the cell is the table cell. It has, by default, a property called text label, which is that main text label in a big font. And it is a outlet, so we're going to go ahead and unwrap it. It's wrapped as an optional. We're going to set its text attribute to be group, and then we can get the property value of this thing by saying value for property, and then the property is just a string. So we can say AL assets group property name. Okay, now this thing's coming back to us. These properties can have different types. So once again, we need to get this thing to conditionally unwrap this as a string. And then we simply return that value. So now if I run this program, okay, notice the very first thing that happens. My application is going to access this user's personal photos. Now, iOS does this automatically. It's the first time my app has tried to access the photos. Before that happens, the user is going to be asked, hey, are you okay with this? This app wants to use your photos. Why would it do that? Well, obviously, if I can get these photos, I could go off and behind the scenes upload them all somewhere else, right? And then, I could compromise the user's privacy. So the user's got to trust the app developer here, right? And so we're going to say yes because I trust myself, and bingo. It just loaded that table with those two rows. But that's kind of a boring looking user interface. We want to make it look more like the one we had up there. I want to put an image off to the left and then the title. So every one of these albums has a default thumbnail, and I want to put that on the screen. So what I want to do is create a custom table cell view. Right? So I want to use something a little bit non-standard. So I'm going to go back into Interface Builder. And I'm going to add myself another prototype. So I'm just going to go down here and search for cell. And I'm going to add a table cell view, drag it up into this table. So it's a second one, and I'm going to give this one a different ID. I'll call this my fancy cell. And I'm going to put a couple things in this cell. I'm going to put an image over here to the left. I'm going to put some text. So let's go to image. So I'll search for an image. There's an image view. I'll put it right there. I'm going to make it smaller. Position it right there. I'll kind of make it square, so 43 by 43. And then I want a label in there. And I'll drag that label to kind of be right centered, standard distance away, like that. I'll expand it like that. And now what I want to do is get this data out of that group object and tuck it on this user interface. Now I'm going to define a brand new custom view class and associate it with this in order to just put a helper function and make this just really, really simple to populate. So I'm going to say create a new class over here, and it'll be a Cocoa class. And what did I call this? I'll call this let's call it album table view cell, and it's going to extend from table view cell. Okay, so there's that. And oh, you know what? I did the wrong thing here, so I'm going to delete this and do it again. I used an iOS, or I used OS 10 instead of iOS. So let me try that again. So I'm going to select here, File New. See what I did here? I picked the wrong one. I'm going to pick this one. and it's going to be album table view cell, UI table view cell. Click next. Yeah, that looks better. And add that. And then I need to go back to my storyboard and make that association. So now I want to select the cell. Okay, so I want to select the cell in the view hierarchy, go over here and type in album table view cell to make that linkage. Now I want to drag and set up some outlets on this view. So if I go over here, this time it's not smart enough to figure this out. This is a custom view. So I'm going to go into manual mode here, find that class right there, and then I'm going to go ahead and set up some outlets here. So this one I'll call the thumbnail, and this one we'll call the title. So there's my outlets, and then I'm going to add myself one more method here that will make it really easy for me to populate this data. So I'm going to create a method called setFromAlbum, and it's going to take an album parameter, which you might have guessed is an AL assets group. And it's not finding that again because I need to import asset library up here. And then I'll say self.thumbnail unwrap image is going to be, and then I can load this thing like this. I can say UI image CG image album.poster image. And then again, this is something I had to research on these APIs. They're not necessarily that well documented on the Apple site. So just take this on by faith. And then we'll say the title text is equal to the album, and this is the same thing we had before, value for property, AL assets group property, name as string. Okay, what's the matter with this now? Assets. Okay, that's why it wasn't doing all the completion a second ago. Oops, one other typo. Sorry about that. Okay. So what's wrong here? Oh. That should work. Okay. So that's good. And then we can go back here to our album controller, and down here we're gonna replace this. So I'm gonna do this a little bit different, so let's just comment this off. So we're gonna do this a bit different here. We're going to actually we're going to type this thing to be of type album table view cell, and then this over here we need to type the cell there, and remember this was fancy cell. We gave it a different ID. So now that cell is actually our custom view class now, and we've got the group. So now all we need to do is replace this line of code with an invocation to cell from, why isn't it work? Oh, set from album, and then we just give it the group. Okay, and if we run that, bingo.